So we're back.
Hooray!
David, Susanne, and me. And today we're going to start with the topic of motivation. And we've been thinking about motivation because, well, in the UK and certainly in other parts of the world, it's exam time as we're doing this conversation. And Suzanne's daughter, you were saying Susanne is doing a set of exams, and you've been reflecting on what motivates her and her schoolmates. So maybe you'd like to kick us off.
Yeah, it's quite interesting because she's quite similar to me in how she's motivated. So we have exams here in the UK about this time. So she's 18. So these are the exams that she takes before she goes to college, to university. So they're a big deal. And but she's very motivated and has been revising for a really long time. We worked out yesterday she's been revising for over 100 days, which is a really long time. But she has that from herself, so there's nobody telling her to do that. The school, I think, offers guidance and suggestions, but she did a revision plan back in February. She's created this plan for herself, and when I was thinking about it, it's very similar to me and how I was at that age and how I am now, actually, that it's kind of inside this motivation of wanting to do a good job, which I just think is inside me, and definitely I see it in her. But of course, inevitably, amongst people she knows, there are people who seem to be very different and do things a bit last minute, and they seem to be fine with that. So I think it's really interesting. There's people in my own family who don't like that kind of preparedness. They prefer to do things last minute because they feel less stressed that way. Whereas that would be the most stressful thing for me, is having to do something like that with no preparation. Other things I'm happy to do without preparation, but anything where I need to study, I would want to be really prepared.
So I wonder if what's motivating her to study, though? Is it the end result? Is it what she wants to do after school? Or is it just that she wants to do these? What is getting her motivated?
I think she definitely has a really clear picture of where she wants to go, and she has done for quite a long time. She knows which university she wants to go to. She knows the course she wants to go to. She knows the grades she has to get, and that it's pretty difficult to get in. So she has that kind of vision, guiding light, I suppose, which I think is leading her there. She knows that she has to do well to get to where she wants to go. But I also think it's a bit more than that. And I'm reflecting on my own experience as well here, that you have that in mind. But then there's also that, certainly for me, that feeling of, I don't want to let myself down. And I don't know whether I wouldn't want to speak for her as to whether that's her motivation too. But that's certainly mine, that I never wanted to do something and walk away from it and think, oh, I could have done more. I could have been more prepared. I could have worked harder at that. That's, for me, is what's always got me to do things.
And if somebody else said the same to you, we want you to do this, we want you, would that make a difference?
No, so it would do the opposite.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, I can't remember that we've had this conversation before, but I don't actually really like people telling me what to do, and it's actually an anti-motivator. So nagging, people putting pressure on, people trying to control what I'm doing is like the anti-motivator, and almost make me do the opposite.
Fascinating. And how about you, David? Do you have some anti-motivators or any motivators?
Well, it's so funny. Yeah, I think I don't remember, Susanne, if you and I talked about this or the three of us did. We're talking about Gretchen Rubin's 4 types related to forming good habits. And both Susanne and I relate to the rebel, where we don't want others telling us what to do. And I don't know how much, Susanne, you can relate to this. And I'm curious, Susan, where one of the challenges that I can relate to with being the rebel is we don't even like ourselves telling us what to do, which makes life kind of challenging. Oh man, yeah. So
I don't think I have that. I think I'm all right at telling myself what to do, and but then I do self-sabotage. So maybe you're right. I think I definitely self-sabotage. It depends what it is, I think.
So what motivates you then, David? You know, what you get out of bed for every morning?
Yeah. So, so a couple thoughts about that. So one is I've always been really like mission driven. And so if I feel like I'm being helpful to people, whether it's, you know, coaching or writing something or getting ready for a seminar kind of thing, that's what motivates me. Um, that being said, and I think this kind of speaks to some of the stuff that we've talked about in the past about Todd Rose's Dark Horse, where he talks about micro motives, like tuning into the little component parts of things that motivate you, and how do they? Because one of the things that I found really lacking in my life when I was just doing speaking at events and training is the one-on-one service of helping people. Just, and when it's just one to many, it like I don't feel the real visceral sense or experience of making a difference or helping somebody, because it's like I hope it made a difference. Do you know what I'm saying? Um, and that motivated me to start doing, you know, doing a career coaching. I think another interesting aspect of like micro motives that just hit me the other day, and I'm thinking like, how can I leverage this more, was I had a networking Zoom meeting with somebody in the career coaching field, and she asked me about some really basic thing we need to do as independent consultants to grow our business. It was doing an easing. Okay, I'll confess, it was doing an easing, and I in my coaching practice, I hadn't set up an e-zine or collected emails. And I know that's just like 101, but I hate doing that stuff. And so I'm like, I hadn't done it in a year. And it's one of those like, you know, you're supposed to, but you don't dilemmas. But because she after I fessed up and said I haven't done it, she said, well, I haven't either. And so I immediately said, hey, do you want to be like accountability buddies that will agree to do it? And she's like, okay. And like, how about 2 weeks from now? And she said, I can't commit to that, but I can at least commit to researching which platform. And this thing that I had procrastinated on for a year, because I felt like if I do it, it'll inspire her to do it. I did it in a week. And I'm like, duh, why didn't I do this a year ago? But it was like that I was able to stumble upon the lever that worked. It's like inspiring others, like be like role modeling what I'm encouraging them to do. So I'm working on like, how do I use more of that, like to do all those things I know I need to do and I'm not I'm not doing.
I'm sure you could just put out a call to action somewhere saying, I'm looking for people who need help with.
Right.
That'll
Have my
force
list.
you. Because it's like a forcing function, isn't it? I mean, that's what it became, a forcing function for you to get beyond your whatever doubts, procrastination, whatever it is. Yeah, I think about motivation a lot because some things just come so easily. And, because I think in a way we have to be motivated to do everything. Anything we do requires motivation, getting up out of bed, brushing your teeth, eating is maybe an easier one for, but some things really require a large degree of motivation. And I go to CrossFit, which, is like high intensity interval training, strength, endurance, that kind of stuff. And I go at 6:15 a.m. is the class, and I only go twice a week, so it's not huge, but I still have to motivate myself to get out of bed at 5:45 a.m. to get there on time and all of that. And I often wonder, like, what drives that? There's something in me that knows it's good for me, or the enjoyment I get out of it, but it's all self-directed. And I wonder, if somebody told me to do it, would I? Probably not. And that's a really interesting thing, even though, and it's not driven by health or anything, it's driven by enjoyment or interest. And I think
I was going
that's
to
a
ask
big
you,
part of
yeah.
motivation, is if you're interested, you'll commit. And that's what I've kind of come to, that I can only make that commitment to something if it interests me. And there's a lot of stuff I have to do that doesn't, so it falls down the list. And I wonder if I think you probably have a few questions there, David, you look like. So maybe ask a couple of questions, because I was going to say, and then let's take this into the workplace and what motivates people at work.
Yeah, I was going to ask you before you said it about, because I know CrossFit is fun compared to just slogging away in the gym. So you enjoy the process of it?
Yeah, and the variety. So there's always, you never have to, no two classes are ever the same. So every time you go, there's different routines, there's usually different people, there's an energy to it that I just find, yeah, really, really fun. Half the time I can't do the stuff that you're meant to be able to do, but that doesn't demotivate me at all, which is really interesting. Like this morning we were doing weightlifting and I kept failing every time I tried to add weight. It just didn't work. But it doesn't seem to bother me, which is really interesting. I just go down in weights and do more, And yeah, there's something really, it's hard to know what it is, but I think it's just interest.
That is interesting.
So, yeah. So the variety, the novelty, how much of it is, so you mentioned the energy, how much of it is the tribe and the like-minded people and the fun atmosphere? Is
You'd
that a
seen the
big
class this
part?
morning, you'd say none of it. No, I think there's something about turning up there and testing yourself. And maybe that's it as well. I like testing myself and pushing myself a little bit to see what I can do in a safe environment. So it's a very safe environment where you're really encouraged. Even, as a woman, nobody takes any notice that you're not as strong as the guys. There's I think it's the environment as well, is very conducive to feeling safe at trying and failing. And there's great encouragement as well. Yeah. And there's no shame on scaling, as they call it. So if you can't do the recommended, no one cares, because you're there for yourself. Yeah, and I don't know, it just works quite well.
I find that really interesting, and it reminds me, I've been reading Atomic Habits. Have you read that book? And it was reminding me about creating that habit, and that when you first start doing something new, you make it easy for yourself. So I don't know whether you put your kit out the night before, put your trainers out, all that sort of stuff, so that when you get up, you kind of have no excuse not to do it. And then I imagine over time, it just becomes, you enjoy it and you get a lot out of it, and then it stops being, oh, I have to motivate myself to do it. But maybe at the beginning, it did feel a bit like that. I can imagine I would feel like that if it were me. I'd be a bit nervous and of doing something new. But then when you get into the habit and you create the habits around the habit, that makes it easier to be motivated.
That's so true. And one of the things I've found as well is kind of setting myself a challenge. So, a 4-week streak. I wanted to make sure that I got out for at least 30 minutes walk every day. And I was kind of letting it fall down my list of priorities. So I set myself a challenge. And now I pretty much do it without even thinking about it. And I think that the habits are really important, Susanne. I think you're absolutely right that we if you want to do something, you have to start small. I remember there's a TED talk actually about it, exercising. And it's not really about exercising, but it's about what we're talking about, I think, the motivation and everything. And the woman basically says, you know, doing it for 1 minute is better than not doing it at all. So if you just do it for 1 minute every day, eventually you're probably going to do it for 2 and 3 and so on. But the day you skip, and that's what I find, when I let a habit drop, it's so hard to pick it up again. I kind of have to start all over with the streak to motivate myself. But there was something, finding the lever that worked. I think that was, that's it. And maybe we all have a lever that works for us.
Well, your scenario, I think, is so fascinating for like multiple levers, multiple elements of why you enjoy it. And it would be fascinating to explore how, and at the risk of going back to Dark Horse, like the micro motives, how those things that work for you, you can apply in other situations. So the variety, the testing yourself, you're not competing against somebody else, you're exploring on your own, no shame. It's all those different things. Yeah.
And I would say the podcast, I don't know how you feel about that, Susanne. And I know, David, you're starting one as well, but that is something that I motivate myself to do. Yeah, sure, I tell people there's an episode going out every week, but I don't think anyone's going to be upset if there isn't. You know, it's not like I'm going to have people knocking down the door going, hey, where's the latest episode? But yet I love doing it. I'm driven to do all of it. Like, I do the whole thing myself. Parts of it I don't really like, but I like the rest of it enough to pull myself over and look for guests and do all of that kind of stuff. And it's variety as well. Again, David, for me, I think the different people you get to talk about the different topics. Is that something you would find too, Susanne? Or
Definitely. I mean, I found with mine that I have periods when I fall in and out of love with doing it, definitely. But I think for me, variety is a big motivator, and I don't have a very good attention span. So I think anything where I've been doing what feels like the same thing for a long period of time, I start to get bored. And I did have a period probably towards the beginning of this year when I did start to get a bit like, I don't know whether I want to be doing it anymore. And I had a chat with Pete, who produces my podcast for me, and he said, well, don't, you know, if you don't want to, but just see what happens. And then actually I had a few, and I think then the pressure was taken off. And then I started to have ideas about who I might want to speak to. And then I got some really interesting guests who I wanted to talk to. So I think it's interesting, but there's bits of it that I don't do, hence why I have a producer, because that's just not my thing. And if I knew I had to edit and produce an episode, I wouldn't do it, because it's just I couldn't do it, and I'd be terrible at it also. So I think I know enough about what I like doing and what motivates me to know that that isn't the thing for me. The bit I like is finding people, doing the research, and then talking to them, and then the rest of it I don't want to do. But luckily,
it's great
Pete's
that you
brilliant
know that too, I think, because a lot of us end up doing stuff we don't want to do, which is a big demotivator. And what about you, David?
Oh man. Yeah, that's an area that I am wrestling with right now, because my podcast, which was supposed to launch late winter, early spring, I've stalled out on the technical side of it. Like, and when I say technical, I actually love editing audio, and I'm okay with editing video. It's just a few stupid things that you both know about that I'm wrestling about. Just suck it up and pay somebody to do it, and move on and do what you love, versus like, oh, that's not, you know, I got to do it myself. So that's a perfect humbling example of like fighting yourself to make yourself do something that you're kicking and screaming internally, not wanting to do.
And
Yeah,
it's so hard to find the motivation then.
for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. If I had to edit my own podcast, there would probably be one episode.
Unedited.
Yeah. And the dog would be barking, and that would be the only episode, because it's just not my thing. I'd probably do it once and then say, no, I didn't like that. I'm not doing it again. Actually, it was a real godsend for me. Before I'd even started to think about doing a podcast seriously, is I met Pete and we had a conversation about it, and I realized, oh, okay, there's someone who lives near me that can do this stuff, and he's really good at it and enjoys it, and he can do that part for me. And then, but also I get so much guidance and support from him. So I think it is about having that knowledge of yourself and what actually is going to make you want to do something. But also I think giving yourself permission sometimes not to do something, because I think, the conversation I had with him about, well, just stop, it hadn't occurred to me that might be an option.
So funny, isn't it?
All right, okay, maybe I could. And then I thought, actually I don't want to, but I think it is that having the permission to stop doing something, and that's okay. It's not a failure, it's just you moved on, and that, I'm sure that time will come. I can't imagine me doing my podcast till the end of time. At some point I'll do something else, and that's okay.
Absolutely. And like what we've been talking about, we're three people, right? We're already established how complex we all are, the things we can and cannot do, or will or won't do. And so if you move into an organization, and what motivates people, let's say en masse, for want of a better term, because we all want everyone working towards the same goal, then how does it work to motivate people? And can we ever actually motivate anyone?
Oh, that's a good question. See, I think from the work that I do around organisation change, this is where a lot of managers and leaders get it wrong, because they don't try and understand the differences between people within their team, and so they try and apply the same techniques and approach to everybody, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So I think there's that piece, which is about really trying to understand people within your team who you have, I'm not going to say control over because that's not right, but you have access to, trying to understand where they're at. But equally, I think you can't motivate everybody all of the time, and I think you have to be okay with that. And again, in the world I work in, this idea of people resisting change, I think it will happen, and it will happen to different people at different times, and you just have to accept that that's the case, and you have to work with it, but you have to accept that you're not going to take everybody with you, that they're not all going to be delighted by this thing that's happening, and that's okay. It's you do as much as you can, but at the end of the day, people's motivation is such a personal thing, and everyone's so different. There's only so much that you can do, and I think when I'm working with people, I often say you try and focus on like the 80%, and everyone else will either come along with you or they won't, and if they're not going to come along with you, they probably never will, and so you just have to be accepting of that.
What about you, David? What would you say?
Yeah, I would love to hear more from both of you around the like understand where they're coming from, and the sort of the good old seek first to understand, because it's so different than the like let's champion this change and use force of will. Like, any stories or more thoughts about having like more understanding and compassion for the natural resistance to change?
I mean, I've probably talked about it before, but my colleague Alan Arnett always uses the analogy of a shiny pen in the approach that most organisations use with change. So the leaders act as the salesman of the shiny pen, and the change is the shiny pen. Look at my shiny pen. Don't you all want the shiny pen? That's the sort of the approach that lots of leaders take. And actually, there's a step before that they haven't done, which is do they actually need a shiny pen? You know, have you bothered to try and find out whether they're even interested in your shiny pen? So I think I think there's a piece of work that, and it's not just during change, it's during, and it's just normal during business as usual, that people can make with their teams and their colleagues, just to try and understand them on a more personal level. So all the time in work, you see that sort of work face. I think that's changing post-COVID, because we've seen a lot more of people's personal life whilst they've been working from home. But really just talk to people and understand who they are and where they're coming from. And then you have an opportunity to appeal to that side of them in the work that you're doing, or getting them engaged and involved in what it is. And you said stories there, David, but I think that's the key to it, is actually listening to people's stories and listening to their experiences and asking them. I mean, you know, has anyone ever asked you, aside from this conversation, David, what motivates you? I mean, has that a conversation that's ever happened at work? It's never happened for me.
No, yeah.
And that's really interesting, Susanne, because one of my colleagues, Helen, and I, we do some like leadership development training together, and we run 5 days for a cohort that are usually within the one organization, and we do it over a period of 3 months. But on the third day, we really focus in on motivation. And actually, I love Dan Pink's model from Drive, you know, that people are motivated by autonomy, mastery, and purpose. I think it's such an easy way to think about it. And even as you were speaking earlier about your daughter, you know, she's self-directed, like there's absolutely no doubt about that. The mastery is her really wanting to get better so she can get into the course that she wants, which is her purpose, because it was a vision and a guiding light. And so, you know, you can kind of fit that model to people. And this is what we say to the guys that we're training, is you think, because a lot of the people we tend to work with for some reason are salespeople, and they think often that their team are motivated by money. That's what motivates them, you know, to go for the incentives and the bonuses and all of that kind of thing. But actually, we say to them, that's driven by something else. So what is it they want the money for? Is it for family holidays? Is it for education funds or whatever? Because then what's that about? It's about keeping the family together. And actually, once you start digging in, you really begin to understand what it is that motivates people, that gives them their own purpose, and not just the organizational purpose. And there's a thing, yeah, pay people more, great. But I don't know. I mean, I was lucky enough to earn very decent money in a couple of jobs I did, but it didn't motivate me more, you know, and it was easier to walk away from because I wasn't motivated by the money. And I think for me, it's pay people enough so money is not an issue. And then you work with people to see what drives them. But there's in 9 Lies About Work, you know, that book that I can't remember who wrote it now, but the Ashley and some other guy, they talk about a study in some hospital in the US where I think it was with doctors, that if they were able to do 20% of their week on something that they really enjoyed doing, that carried them over for the rest of the time. And I think others have shown that in other places as well, that actually, if even for 20% of your working day or working week, you get to have autonomy, mastery, purpose in your own way, that will give you enough motivation to continue. So they're the kind of things I think about, David, if that answers your question.
Yeah, and also 2 quick things based on what you said. So when you talked about getting money off the table, I think one of the things I've seen so often is managers, leaders don't understand the difference between hygiene factors, which is that, and what truly motivates people. Like one of the things I'll say to a group, I'll say, so here's an example of a hygiene factor. If this seminar room was 90 degrees, it would definitely diminish your enjoyment of the seminar. But if we get it down to, let's say 70, you're not going to tell your friends, oh, I went to this great seminar today. It was 70 degrees. You know? So hygiene versus motivation. The other thing, and it's funny because I asked you, like, so tell me more about like, how do you understand people, et cetera. And then as you're sharing, I'm thinking, man, it really makes me think, going back to curiosity is getting curious versus judgy. And I sort of flashed onto examples. It kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier with like not doing what we need to do. Is like, if I'm working with somebody and they don't do their agreed upon quote homework, and I'm telling myself a story like, oh, they're not motivated, they're lazy, they don't take it seriously. And instead of coming from that judgy point of view, asking like, so what happened? And it turns out they didn't understand it, like what the assignment was or whatever. It's like, oh, right. Get curious, not furious. Get curious instead of judging. So
I haven't heard that one before. Get curious, not
yeah, isn't that a great saying? I heard that. I'll give a shout out to where I first heard it, a guy named Mel Silberman. And he said, people with high emotional intelligence, when they deal with difficult people, they get curious, not furious. I'm like, man, I need more of that. So
I
yeah.
think we do tend to like, if we have a team, we tend to just think they're all going to be the same. Even if, you know, let's say I worked in finance and you just kind of think, well, they're all going to be motivated by the same things, but we're just not. Even within the same family, we're not motivated by all of the same things all of the time. And I think even deeper than that, we don't necessarily know what motivates us.
No,
And
you're right. I think we almost know what we don't like, what demotivates, more than we know what motivates. It's easy to think of situations where we've not felt motivated at work, but it's harder to think about a time, oh, when did I feel really motivated? Because I don't think you notice it in the moment, do you? That's the issue.
because I suppose you're kind of in flow as well. And are all of these terms the same thing then? That's the other thing. As we're talking, I'm thinking about engagement, you know, and what we say about engaging people at work. Is that the same as motivating? Is that the same as having people in flow? Are these terms, how do we distinguish between them? Or are they very intermingled? That if you get one of the ingredients wrong, you'll ruin the cake. If you get them all right, you'll get the icing on the cake. Anyone have an idea?
I've got a couple thoughts. So one quick little fun fact related to flow state. There was a really interesting white paper by McKinsey and Company on flow states and with executives. And in some survey they did with executives, they said that they were 500% more productive whenever they were in a flow state. So anything and everything we can do to hack, like, how do you get into a flow state worth the effort? And I think about for engagement in, so to me, when we're motivated and engaged, we're probably in a flow state. And I think of engagement is like motivation aligned with the employer's goals. So they want to do a great job to contribute, and they're able to do a great job. So that's sort of the combination. And back to the themes of today, that each person, I like to think of it as each person has an engagement recipe, like different ingredients that need to be there. So back to, I think, Susanne, you're talking about, or actually both of you, knowing the individual team members and, you know, what motivates them. So they are in that state of flow and high performance.
I think you're right, and I think it is, they are interrelated. So I wonder, is it possible to be in a flow state if you're doing something that you don't find motivating? I suspect not. And if someone is demotivated, they're not likely to be engaged with something. I think I read a paper once about enchantment, organizational enchantment, which I really like as a phrase instead of engagement. So it's like, you know, you can't motivate somebody who isn't engaged. You can't engage someone who isn't motivated. So they're so interconnected. But I guess for a person to feel engaged in the organization, they need to have all the things that you were talking about earlier, Susan, in terms of autonomy and purpose, and which is why during a period of change or transformation, I think people don't feel that, and then they don't feel engaged because they lose that certainty, that autonomy. It's David Rock, isn't it, who's got his SCARF model, which I absolutely love, which is, you know, you have to have those factors aligned, and people need to have answers to their questions about the SCARF factors. Otherwise they feel uncertain, and then their brain sort of trips into like a fight or flight reaction, and they can't engage. So it's trying to line everything up, I think. But I do think you can use the, almost like flow is an output of motivation and engagement, I would say.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. It does. And I mean, I don't think, you know, if we told you, well, if you told yourself that you were going to edit a podcast episode, you would never be in flow doing that. And unless you surprised yourself, of course, and found that actually, I love this.
Well, that's true. And I can get very engaged in things that are actually, you know, perhaps some people might think would be quite menial. So one of the things I actually really like doing is making a really nice PowerPoint slide. I really enjoy doing that, and I can definitely get into flow doing that. Now it's I suppose in some ways it probably is intellectually demanding, in that you've got to try and group information together and all of that sort of thing, but I actually really like it. I'm working with a client at the moment, and I'm actually quite in demand all the time. They keep sending me emails like, Susanne, can you make this look pretty? And I'm actually going to do like a lunch and learn session for them just about how to do it. But I get a lot of pleasure out of that. But it's not the day job, but I actually do quite enjoy it.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think what you were saying as well then about change is if change is being announced or whatever, the fight or flight, I mean, we possibly are losing autonomy over how our job is going to be done. We're losing mastery because we're going to have to start all over again with something we didn't know how to do. And we may well buy into the purpose of it, because we might be, as you were saying, David, you know, we might be engaged in the workplace and buy into the purpose of the organization, but just those other ones have fallen out of balance. And keeping all of those together is, for everyone, that's probably a big ask.
Yeah, I don't think you can. I think I'm thinking about some of the work I do with leaders, and I think you have the kind of the corporate message, but I think the work of the leader is to then tailor that to what they know about their team members. So, you know, the corporate communications department cannot create a single message that's going to tick everybody's boxes, but they can share the information that needs to be shared. And I think it's for leaders then to tailor that. It's Noel Tichy, isn't it, what he does about the leadership point of view and the teachable point of view. So you have to, as a leader or a manager, get this information. You shouldn't just parrot it, you know, well, I've been told to tell you this. No, that's not going to work. You have to review it, understand it, then think about who am I communicating this to, and how can I add things to it that's going to make it of interest to them.
Yeah, and you have to have bought into it as well. And
Yes.
that can even be a step that's missed, that, you know, as it's being passed down, that whoever is responsible, somewhere along the line, that message goes wrong, and then I don't buy into it. So anyone I tell, and that will ripple on as well. And you know, you mentioned resistance, and I think a lot about resistance when it comes back to CrossFit now, right? Because you do resistance training. Okay, and if you resist something, it just makes it harder. So you're making it harder for yourself as well. There's a tension that and when you relax, the resistance tends to go. So there's a bit about helping people relax into the story of change, as opposed to, and that's to what you said about anxiety as well, I think. How do we don't think like that, I think, because we get stressed then when change isn't happening as quickly as it's supposed to be and everybody's resisting. We start to resist that story, which creates even more tension. So how can we relax into change, or can we?
Got some thoughts around that. Yeah. So, and I'm gonna go back to David Rock and Scarf, etc. So a couple of things. One goes back to what we were talking about before in terms of really trying to understand each person and where they're coming from, etc. Is you think about when somebody is proposing something to us that we feel like strongly opposite or just we're not into it, we're way less likely to listen and take in what they're saying if we don't get to share our resistance, our concern. So again, it speaks to the seek first to understand. And one of the ways I think about it, they'll say to people, it's like, if somebody's really upset with you and they need to tell their story, if you don't let them tell their story, it's like a balloon that's going to explode. But if you let them tell their story, it's like if you blow up a balloon, but you don't tie it off, it goes shh, and eventually it drops because there's no more energy behind it. Like, people need to tell their upsetness, and then they can relax into hearing what you have to say. I think the other thing, to kind of go back to Susan, when you were talking about Daniel Pink's mastery, meaning, and autonomy, I think another, and then linking it to the how the brain is structured and the primitive part of the brain is, I'm going to butcher this, but it'll be my best shot at, there's this really cool quote by the Russian, I think he was a neurologist or neuroscientist, one of the two, Luria. So the part of the brain, the Luria part, is based on him. He said something like, you need to activate the prefrontal lobe through envisioning a future in order to keep the reptilian brain, which is always seeing the sky is falling and hyper focuses on the immediate stressors and challenges. You need to activate the prefrontal lobe to dampen that down, so it's not like sweating the small stuff. And I think that's where the vision of, this is the good stuff that will happen if we move forward, and like that why, including the good stuff that'll happen with you. So that's the moving forward part, but also back to mastery and autonomy. It's and then Susanne, you talked about James Clear, and I love where he talks about so many, he uses the garden hose kinked analogy, and he says, like, how most people talking about developing good habits, it's like crank up the water pressure to force get jacked up to force yourself to do those things. It's like, how about if we unkink the hose? Like, what are those obstacles? And when I think about our, everybody's natural, most people's natural resistance to change, one of the big ones is, employees not feeling like they have the skills to deal with the change, especially if it's a new technology rollout. And then back to the theme that both of you have been mentioning with autonomy, that I feel like this is done to me, so I don't have any agency. So it's like, how do we upskill them? And how can we design into it as much positive control as possible so they don't feel like a total lack of autonomy? So those are some of the things that came up for me.
I love
And
that. Yeah, and I think it is about giving them that really clear vision, but in a way that is not too corporate and actually is very personal, so that it's, you know, at the end of the day, as an employee, you want your
no,
employer
Susanne
to
is
do
kind of
well, but you don't actually care that much about what, you know, what this means and everything else. It's what you want is to know how this is going to affect you. What's in it for me? What's my working day going to look like in this new world? And a client of mine created a whole load of cartoons when they were introducing a change, that had kind of a day in the life of different employees, and it was voiced by real employees, and they'd interviewed them and talked about what their work was like now and what it might be like in the future, and then they released them and people could watch them. It was amazing, people loved it, and huge levels of engagement, and actually it was real people, and it wasn't about Mr. CEO, you know, what's going to happen to him. It was about, you know, Fred Bloggs, who works in IT, what's his day going to be like. And I think it's that bit, taking it down to that level of understanding, you know, that kind of town hall, let's all meet in a room and I'm going to tell you what's going to happen, is just maybe necessary, but it needs to be followed up with other stuff. And I think that's the bit that's missing. And the other thing I was thinking about when you were speaking, from my own experience, is my view of resistance has changed over the years. So I think when I first started out as a consultant working in change, I used to get very annoyed by people who were resisting change, because it just made my life harder, and, you know, it was just difficult, because I think I was too young and inexperienced to really understand where it was coming from. And I think over time I've kind of reframed it in my own head as, it's not resistance, it's super engagement. So this person is so engaged in what is happening that they are asking questions, they're poking holes in it, they're being difficult because they want to know more. And I think as a leader and as a consultant, or anyone working as a change practitioner, you have to ask yourself, well, what is it that they're struggling with? Is it that you just haven't told them enough and they don't understand it and you need to tell them more? Is it that actually there's something wrong with your process, but they've identified it and you haven't? Well, let's engage with it. And it goes back to the conversation we had right at the beginning about that curiosity and being curious about why it's happening, rather than just, as I used to be, oh, this is really annoying, it's just going to add an extra week to our plan. Well, let's dig down into it and try and figure out where it's coming from, because actually maybe this person knows more about it than I do, and I can learn something from them. I mean, there'll always be the odd person who's just awkward, and that's fine too, but you don't know that until you actually spend some time digging into it. And sorry, I thought of something else. I don't want to hog the conversation, but the most recent podcast that I recorded was with a gentleman called Dr. John Lorna, who works in the field of narrative medicine. And he used an analogy, which I know you guys will love, about asking questions and being curious. He said he sees it as weaving a tapestry, not digging a hole. So typically you'd think about, oh, we've got to dig into the detail. No, it's about asking questions that enable us to explore the story in more detail. When you were speaking, David, I really thought of that, about that exploration. And he also said that we have to be curious enough to destabilize ourselves. And I think that's what stops people from being curious, because it's like asking a question is a sign of weakness, or what if it takes me down a hole that I don't know the answer. And I think it's about creating that instability in ourselves that means we can be curious enough to ask more questions.
I love that. That's
I know,
very powerful,
isn't
very,
it?
very powerful.
His stuff's amazing. He's written some amazing books. It's yeah, I did a podcast with him. It was released, I think, last week. So it's so interesting, completely different field, but so many parallels to kind of corporate life.
And yeah, the destabilizing ourselves. And I think the other thing I think of there is, we've been brought up, I would say, to always look for solutions. You have to find the solution. So what's the solution to shutting this person down? Or how do we, you know, that's the solution, we'll shut them down. And actually, you know, I think I often quote that Einstein quote of, if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes on the problem and understanding it, and then 5 minutes on the solution. And there's so much about understanding the problem and digging into that. And oftentimes when it comes to change, we've gone beyond that. We've figured out what's the right thing to do, perhaps, but we haven't brought people with us. and they still don't understand the problem with the old.
Yeah, and you have to as well, I think, balance that with recognizing that there was some good stuff that happened in the past. So again, appreciative inquiry is a model that I use a lot in my own work, and part of that is appreciating the best of what is. And I think if you're trying to motivate people, don't tell them that everything they did before was really rubbish.
Never a good strategy.
No. So you have to be able to demonstrate what is being carried forward and why that is the case. And again, I used to cringe when I had my corporate job, that some of my colleagues would come in and basically rip apart everything that had done before, and you think these people are sitting in the room, you're basically saying everything they've done for 10 years is bad, and we have to replace it with something else, and then you expect them to want to work with us. Why would they do that? So I think it's that balance of not constantly wanting to move forward, but being prepared to look back and take some of that with you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Have you anything to add there, David?
I just love the being annoyed with the change. That's so true. It's like, come on, just get with the program. Jeez. The one thing that kind of popped up in my mind, back to like understanding more of the like neurobiology or just the biology of resistance to change. That one of the things that was interesting, I can't remember who it was with the interview, but they were talking about, keep in mind that caloric conservation is one of the most important survival programs, because as opposed to our world, for at least for us, that finding calories is not an issue. It's like not consuming too many is more the issue. But in, caveman, cavewoman days, finding calories is really critical. So don't waste any. And so sticking with the old ways conserves calories. And also, since, as you know, the brain, when we're thinking and problem solving, uses lots of calories, sticking with the tried and true saves energy. And so there's this like really primal drive that keeps us from, and the people we're hoping to, embrace change, keeps that from happening. So I think that's another little data point that can help us from being annoyed and like judging the resistance.
That's brilliant. And one of the podcast guests that I've had on a couple of times, Steve Haynes, he says people are gloomy, lazy predictors. Because that's what we're like. We look for the negative in things, we're lazy because we're trying to conserve those calories, we really are. And we're constantly predicting what's in it for me, what's coming next. And if you can kind of couch all of that, and he means it in the nicest possible way, of course, but he writes a bit about the brain and anxiety and panic and stuff. And I think once anyone understands, for me, once I understand more about how my brain works and my biology and my neurophysiology and whatever, all of those terms, it just shifts how I approach things. And I would love to see more of the world being more exposed to how we actually work. And then you work out your own motivators. I don't need somebody to tell me or ask me what motivates me. I'll know, because I'll know so much about myself.
I feel like, you're so right. And that should be part of management education, leadership education, because it moves you from being, oh, this person's really annoying, to I'm finding them annoying, but I know why they're doing it. And I think for me also, there was that realization that the field that I work in it because I like change and variety, and you've all talked about liking change and variety, which means change is going to be easier for for people like us, because we get a kick out of it. There's a whole load of people who really don't like it. It makes them feel uncomfortable, and that's okay. And I think you have to accept that in any team there'll be people who really enjoy new things and people who don't. And again, if you understand more about that person, you can reassure them, you can do what needs to be done to help them realize, you know, change sadly is inevitable, but there's ways that we can make it easier for people who don't have it as a motivator.
Yeah, rather than saying to them, why can't you just be like Susanne, David,
Yeah, exactly.
and Susan?
Stop being so annoying.
Yeah.
Get with the program.
Yeah. It makes me think about, so I finally read Susan Cain's book Quiet, so the book for introverts, and when she talks about the expectations in the workplace and how if you're not like jumping in and talking in the team meeting, like what's up with you, etc. And when you were saying that last bit, Susanne, it made me think about rather than like say making the quieter team members wrong for being quieter, understand how they operate and how to work with that. Just like the change averse people, they're not wrong, they're just different than the people who love change. And like another aspect of neurodiversity.
Exactly.
And working with that.
You can't have a whole team of people who are extroverts, or a whole team of people who are introverts, or a whole team of people who like change and a whole team of people who don't. It would be a nightmare. You know, I always, about neurodiversity, I always read the quote about it was the neurodiverse who actually got us out of the caves, because if we wasn't for somebody neurodiverse, we'd all still be sitting there in a cave. It was that person who's like, I wonder what's out there. And I think that's, you know, we need difference. But going back to what I said earlier, the way that organization processes are set up, that it treats everybody the same, and there's not enough of that making it different for different people, because it takes longer and it's harder and a bit more effort and more destabilizing. But actually, if you think about it, how on earth, if you've got an organization of 8,000 people, how on earth can you expect one single email or PowerPoint presentation from the CEO to make everyone want to do something different? It's just not going to work. And
that reminds me, I have two things to pick up on, because David, you talked about Quiet, that book, and that really, I mean, that helped me so much in my career. I remember when I read it, because I used to get this feedback all the time about how I didn't speak up enough in meetings, and it used to just so annoy me, because it was like, if I have something to say, I'll speak, okay? And I remember reading that book, and she says, you know, if people don't speak up in meetings, telling them to speak up in meetings is the worst thing you can do. So I went to my boss and I said, here, read this. But that was one thing. And then what you were saying there, Susanne, I think the School of Life, who I really like their stuff. One of the things in one of their, I can't remember which book, I think it's The Emotionally Intelligent Office, they say, you know, work would be great if everyone was like me. And I think that's what happens, is the CEO of the 8,000 people goes, why can't everyone just be like me? Here, off you go, just implement it. And I think that's, we're beginning to see, I hope, in the world that the people who get promoted into those positions are often not the people who should be in those positions. They should not be responsible for other people, or they should have the right people around them that they at least listen to and let them shepherd them, so that they can just be the queen or the king and not be the lord and master.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think I worked on a project a couple of years ago where there was that recognition that they'd done change before, where it was like a sheep dip is what they said, and everyone just did the same training, same comms, and it didn't work. And they recognized that it hadn't worked. So when I started talking to them, they just said, we need to do something different this time, not that. And so what we embarked upon was a program of change, which was, we did team by team in this and it was in part of the organization, a contact center. And I just went out and met with them and talked to the teams and went to team meetings and popped up here and there doing various things, trying to understand where they were at, and then almost doing like tailored interventions for each team. And it was very time consuming, but very rewarding, because actually you could cover all sorts of things. So, you know, popping up in a team meeting, you could do some stuff about the change, but you could also do some team building, or you could answer some questions about something else. So it was good. And actually, I think they realized that worked a whole lot better. Now, it was for a relatively small population, but there's no reason why you couldn't do that in a big organization. You just have to have more people out there doing it.
And you can also find the people inside who are those influencers that are kind of the natural influencers, so to speak, that people respect them and listen to them. It doesn't matter where they are in the organization, they're the change makers, let's say. And if you find them, then they will help you go a very long way, I think. And often they're ignored, because they're often the ones as well, I think, that are resisting at the beginning, because they know the things that will go wrong. And so they're quite vocal sometimes, and they're mistaken for troublemakers instead of change makers. Possibly. I'm probably thinking about myself.
No, I think that is such a huge point. Such a huge point.
And if you think about it, in a lot of organizations, when, you know, they have good ideas about, or let's have some change champions or whatever, but they don't necessarily go about it the right way. So they ask people to volunteer. Well, that might not always be the right people. So I think it's about really identifying who those people are, who are the influencers. And sometimes they, as you say, Susan, they might well be people who are seen as troublemakers or difficult or whatever, but actually they're respected, and they're the people you should have, not the person who sticks their hand up and volunteers for everything. And you know, people are fed up of them doing all the, on this committee, that committee, you know, whatever. It's about choosing the right people to do it.
Wow. I mean, no wonder. I still wonder sometimes how the world keeps turning. Because, you know, the more you learn about all of this stuff, the more surprised I am that I'm even here still, you know, because just the world is so complex, but so amazing as well. And there's so much to be said for getting under the skin of things like we've done today, even looking at what motivates us, or exploring what demotivates us, or being told what to do or not, and and there's a lot of reward in that. I think that's intrinsically motivating as well. Maybe that's the thing, for me at least. But if people listening or watching even, you know, wanted to think more about how to understand what motivates them, or, you know, where would they start? Maybe with some resources. We've been good the last few times thinking about resources, and we've mentioned quite a lot actually already. But is there anything that either of the two of you can think of when it comes to motivation and motivation to change?
You want me to go first, David? Or happy to.
Yeah.
So yeah, all the books I think that have been mentioned, there's some great books out there. I think it's spending some time thinking about yourself and about situations where you have felt really motivated or in flow, and think about what that was, and what can you take from that. I think there's always lots of like personality questionnaires and stuff, which I'm not always a big fan of, but sometimes they can give you some interesting pointers into why you are different. So things like insights and things like that can give you an idea of the sorts of situations that are motivating or demotivating for you, and sort of the baseline of your personality. Maybe even ask people. I mean, but how often do you ask other people, you know, when if like your family or colleagues or boss, you know, when have you seen me at my best? When was I at my best? And then get some pointers for that. I think that's quite useful.
Brilliant. Thanks, Susanne. David?
Yeah. So besides the books that we mentioned, and another shout out to Atomic Habits, fantastic book. Another really good book on motivating oneself is Change Anything. And I think it's by the group that used to be called Vital Smarts. Now it's Crucial Learning. And one of the things I loved about them is they talk a lot about the importance of changing our environment to support new habits. Another thought is sort of vis-a-vis our conversation about your CrossFit endeavors, like for people to sort of deconstruct the times they feel really motivated and like, okay, what about that has been motivating, and how could I translate that to other areas? And then the last as a combo is just practicing what we've talked a lot about as far as that, just bringing more curiosity versus annoyance, to those pesky people who aren't getting with the program. And then lastly, when you were talking, Susan, about the complexity, oh my God, of today's world, and just the complexity of dealing with fellow humans, one of the things I've really noticed over the years is the confidence or assurance in my perspective being right goes down as my humility goes up, and realizing, I don't necessarily have any clue why that person is acting that way. Rather than judging them, how about like having a conversation? How about being a little more spacious?
Brilliant. I love that. both of what you've said, actually, because I was going to say the personality test too, Susanne, because I think there's so many of them, but they can give you the language that helps you articulate and start that journey yourself into thinking. And I think as well what you said, David, deconstructing stuff. But what I found, funnily enough, is trying to take one thing to another doesn't always work as well. So I had something that really worked for me specifically, and I tried to apply that to something else, and it just didn't work. So I think for me, it's tapping into your interest, and it's like, I suppose finding out, why do I really want to do this, and just keep drilling down, the 5 whys. So keep asking yourself until you get to it. And maybe then you're balancing the reasons for doing it against the reasons for not doing it. And if the reasons for not doing it are bigger, then forget it. So that also requires a bit of radical honesty with yourself. And I think that's also a difficult thing to do. But and you'll be motivated to do other things differently. I think that's the other thing, maybe, is not keep it all to, if I'm motivated to brush my teeth every morning, it doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to be motivated to ride my bike to work. I bring different levels of motivation to different things I do, and thinking about that at work as well, I suppose, in the different tasks. And maybe you'll find that actually for one day a week you're super motivated, you just haven't really thought about it, and your job isn't as bad as you think it is. So I think we've mentioned so many books. It's more, what can you do yourself, that I think of. So, I mean, that's been so much fun. Again.
I know.
For sure.
And I'm looking forward to reconvening next quarter for, well, who knows what we'll be talking about then.
Thank you both.
Thank you.